an important question. I think we need to understand that President Biden, along with most everyone in Washington, is caught up in a time warp. Let me explain what that is. We are, frankly, at the end of what they sort of affectionately call the post-war liberal political order or world order. There's a notion that after World War II we set up something, and it was more than just something. You know, you had the Bretton Woods, and it changed the way we did business financially, and we established ourselves in the aftermath of World War II as essentially the world's hegemonic financial power. People don't realize that. They think of us almost exclusively in terms of economics or military power. Well, that was true because we were the last man standing. You know, we were the only country that participated in the two world wars, and our infrastructure ended up intact. Everyone else was utterly and completely destroyed at the end of World War II, and I include in that, of course, the Soviet Union. But we did emerge as this financial hegemon as well, and we set up a system that was designed to perpetuate our power, our influence, and our prosperity, which is somewhat understandable. The end of the Cold War effectively set the stage for something new. But instead of looking for something new, we spent our time trying to figure out how we could keep what we have and expand it. And so NATO, instead of going through the transformation that most of us at the time saw underway, ends up being a Trojan horse for the further expansion of Washington's hegemonic power, financial, economic, and military. At the time, of course, most of us, and I'm talking about the other officers that I worked with closely at NATO headquarters, or SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, Germans, French, Dutch, everybody. We thought at the time, and this is 1998, 99, and even earlier than that, 95, we thought that NATO really existed to prevent wars from breaking out, that we were in the business of suppressing conflict. In other words, finding solutions without the use of force. Well, Bosnia-Herzegovina was the beginning of the end of that.
1999.
The Bosnia-Herzegovina is 95.
95.
And you'll recall that we used our air power there to supposedly support the Croats and Bosniaks in and around Sarajevo against the Serbs. The truth is that the air power wasn't as nearly effective against the Serbs as we said. In fact, the British and the French artillery that was used against them was worse, did more damage. But the point was that we intervened for the first time on European soil with American military power, killing other Europeans. Now, there were very few people at that point who were harmed. Then we went through this sort of tremendous, convulsive set of months trying to figure out what do we do with Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that's where I came into the picture. This was after the airstrikes, and I was sent over by then Lieutenant General Wes Clark to Sarajevo to be his direct representative and liaise primarily with the Bosniaks and secondarily with the Croats, which made sense because I spoke German, and at the time, that was the lingua franca that the Croats and the Bosniaks were accustomed to. This was before English sank deep roots there, and so today you can go and speak English without any trouble at all. But at the time, for the Croats and the Bosniaks, it was German. And by the way, for the Serbs, it was French. So I didn't have much interaction at that point with the Serbs, but it was a very useful time for me because I was given an armored Fairlane 500 automobile and a driver, and the driver had actually gone through Winter Ranger with me. He was a sergeant from the Ranger regiments, which was funny because we knew each other. We ended up driving all over Bosnia and parts of Herzegovina to try and establish where, if we had the opportunity to draw new lines, they should be drawn. And after about a month or more of this, I guess about 5 weeks, I was suddenly summoned to return to Dayton, Ohio, where they were holding what they called the proximity talks, which is essentially a negotiating session with the various parties behind chain link fences under guards so no one could get in or get out, with Ambassador Holbrooke at the head of this business, and of course General Wes Clark there as the military deputy, who spent a lot of his time trying to compete with Holbrooke for control of and exploitation of information. I mean, the Byzantine politics behind all of it was entertaining. The one thing I can say is that eventually Holbrooke, to his credit, discovered that you cannot force the Serbs, the Bosniaks, and the Croats back into some sort of integrated, multi-ethnic, multi-cultural diversity paradise. I mean, after all these people had been killing each other, there was a lot of blood spilled. That wasn't going to work. And so he finally jettisoned that. There were lots of bizarre people, though, from London and Paris, and I would argue other places. Carl Bildt's an example. He was there from Sweden. Lunatic ideas about how you were going to force people to go to school together and live together that didn't want to be there. And I remember sitting next to one of the Clinton appointees who said to me, well, you know, at the time I was, was I a lieutenant colonel or a colonel? I guess I was a promotable lieutenant colonel. And he said, well, you know, Colonel Macgregor, after all, these people are effectively all the same people. They speak virtually the same language. There are no differences.
Yeah.
And I said to this man, I said, well, you've got to take something into account. The people that live here, they think those differences are rather significant. But that wasn't something the Clinton crowd was interested in listening to. Now, I say Clinton, I'm not talking about President Clinton. I'm talking about the people under him. Because truthfully, President Clinton wanted nothing to do with any of it. I mean, he knew nothing about it, didn't understand it, and he'd just as soon stay home, which was, I thought, a good thing. But unfortunately, he lost that fight. And so Madeleine Albright and everybody else who was then knocking around in the State Department and Praeger and, I guess it was Deutsch at that point, I've forgotten, they all were pushing some sort of arrangement. And the only reasonable person that I listened to was Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense. And he said something to General Clark that I thought made a lot of sense. He said, look, there doesn't have to be an agreement. He said, no agreement is better than a bad agreement. Secondly, we don't want any agreement that commits U.S. forces for any long-term possibility to the Balkans. We don't want to mire U.S. forces in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then he finally said, by the way, whatever you do, don't give us any Danzig corridors. We don't want to go through that again. So these should be clean outcomes. So then I'm back, and suddenly I'm told to put together a plan to draw maps. And a very, very nice guy was with me at the time who had been a brigade commander when I was at Fort Riley. He came in, and he was wonderful. And the two of us, we sat there, and we tried to put together a series of arrangements, all of which were terribly meaningless because every time we drew a line somewhere, I was told by General Clark, you've got to draw it in a way that is beneficial to the Bosniaks because they're not very good at military affairs. They're poor soldiers. So you've got to give them some advantage if there's a resumption of fighting. Okay, well, I'd been everywhere, so I had some appreciation for that, but it didn't work because the man at the time, Izetbegovic, whose real name was Izar Bey, he was originally a Turk, and his ancestors had come from Anatolia. He would say, well, I was just out in this village and that village, and I told everybody there they were going to be part of the new Bosniak state. So suddenly you had to adjust the lines and move things around. Make a long story short, there really was no agreement at the end of this. But there was a sort of almost a hand-driven, written map by Holbrooke. And Holbrooke recognized there has to be a Croat area, there has to be a Serb area, there has to be a Bosniak area. And what emerged from this is, of course, the current Bosnian state or Bosniak state, which is the first official Muslim state in Europe, which nobody in the Balkans wanted. Other people in Europe weren't paying much attention, but clearly nobody in the Balkans wanted to do this. And all they got was initials on the paper. But that was enough for a news conference. And a big splash said, we have peace in our time, effectively. And, of course, then there were all sorts of arrangements made to pour vast funding, which created incentives for people who would otherwise shoot each other to essentially take the money, shut up, and do other things. So we've had some modicum of stability there, but it's always been misleading because there's a history with all of these peoples. And over time it became very clear that even though the Croats and the Turks hated each other, and the Serbs hated each other, they both agreed what they didn't want was a Muslim state in Bosnia. Well, they got it, one way or another. This is the sort of, I don't know how to frame it, but self-delusion that begins to guide all the thinking in Washington about the world. So you cannot view what happened then as isolated from what's going on today in Ukraine. There's just an unwillingness to see reality, an unwillingness to even take into account history, geography, language, ethnicity, all of these things. They all matter.
History that lays the future conflicts, prepares for the next conflict.
And so, Kosovo was inevitable because you had these groups of Albanians that had, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which had begun life as a Stalinist drug mafia. This becomes our Trojan horse that invites American military intervention in Kosovo. And eventually we succeed in dragging in NATO into something else. And as I think I mentioned several times to several people, I watched a German general officer on the night that Belgrade was bombed with the tears streaming down his cheeks because he said, this is what we all oppose.
Yeah.
He said, this is the anniversary of the German assault on Belgrade in 1941. We don't want this.
Were there at the time among your colleagues, were there any qualms of conscience about bombing? Were some of you...
Well, you got to understand, first of all, the Americans, for the most part, didn't know anything about it. And this is the sad part, that Americans are almost completely ignorant of the world beyond the borders of the United States. So if you tell them, this group is bad, this group is good, well, they all sign up, okay, what are we doing? What's the target set? Show me where we got to go. And that kind of was the mentality, particularly with the air and naval forces. And let's be honest, you don't pay people like me in uniform to stand around and question the orders that are given by the President of the United States. I mean, that's not what we're paid to do. We're paid to act. Now, your hope is that senior officers will step in and say, well, Mr. President, is this really a good idea?
Yeah.
Maybe there's an alternative. One of the alternatives, by the way, that never comes up, is the Germans, under Kohl, wanted to invest very heavily to build dual cities. In other words, there's a place called Berchko, and there were terrible struggles in Berchko between the various ethnic groups. Germans said, fine, we'll build a new Berchko, and this can be a Bosniak Berchko. And then the Serbs can have the other Berchko.
Just give them all their own realms.
Right. And then later on, the Germans came forward and said, we'll fund the movement of people. Let's move the Serbs out of these Muslim areas in Kosovo. Let's move the Albanians away from the Serb areas, and we'll create these enclaves. By the way, there's a lot of evidence that would have worked.
Interesting.
Especially when you go up to Mitrovica, which is a strip of land or territory along the border between what today we call Kosovo and Serbia. But these things were all rejected.
Yeah, and they weren't wanted. It seemed that the idea was with military force you can solve problems.
Well, not just solve
problems. And as you know, 1999, the new concept of humanitarian intervention
yes, yeah, absolutely.
was a total change in international relations and law, that the United States could start playing the international police force, going wherever they deemed right to intervene and go with force. And
well, I would go a step further, and I would say the Washington plays God and determines who is good and who is evil, regardless of the facts on the ground.
So would you say, looking back on 1999, the military intervention wasn't right?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I thought, as many of us did at the time, there's got to be a way to do this without bombing. And that's where, of course, the Germans behind the scenes had said, we'll front 6 billion euros or marks or whatever at the time, because this was before the euro really set in. Nobody would look at it, but and then say, well, we're not going to allow populations to be moved around. They're going to learn to live together in the new Europe that's being built. Well, what if the new Europe doesn't want to exist? Now, here we are. This is 2024. And look at the catastrophic results of these mass migrations, which effectively is a repetition of the same insane thinking by large numbers of very similar people, if not even the same people. That's just crazy. And then you look at what's happening to us on the border. All of this is coming back to haunt us. We're now being subjected to the same lunacy that the Europeans have been subjected to. All of it begins in the Balkans.
Yeah, that's so true.
And the other thing that's interesting is that at the time, Russia was always painted as this inevitable objective. I was once told, don't you understand? This is the beginning of a democratic revolution that's going to sweep to Belgrade, from Belgrade all the way to Moscow. And so, someone who knew a little bit about Europe, I just sort of winced.
And that would have been my next question. 1999. It was the former under Soviet rule Yugoslavia, and United States intervened only a few years after the fall of communism in Soviet Union. That was already an encroachment toward the former realm of the Soviet Union. And was there an angle to that intervention with regard to Russia?
Yes.
They really thought that it would be a start of a democratization, but it was then also an Americanization. I mean, the idea was already then essentially we start with Kosovo and wind up in Moscow, and everything comes under our rule.
Well, I think...
essentially, I mean, we would...
Effectively, yes. In other words, the American financial hegemony, political hegemony, and potentially military hegemony is all preserved, and ultimately everyone falls under it in the new world order. But at the time, when I heard this statement about Moscow, I just concluded these people have lost their minds.
But later, looking back,
Absolutely.
now the last 25 years, it starts making, there is a consistency of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you just mentioned, that people don't realize, that Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union were similar. They were multi-ethnic, multinational.
And easily to be manipulated.
Oh, very much so.
To be stirred up.
Very much so. And you had this sort of outburst of energy and frustration and anger that came about in Yugoslavia. We then, on humanitarian grounds, saw this as an opportunity to intervene.
Yeah.
Russia then comes apart at the seams, or Soviet Union does, and then you have, of course, the Solzhenitsyn solution, which is we need to get away from all these other peoples. We should just be Russians, which is perfectly reasonable in my judgment, and I think Solzhenitsyn was a great man. But at the same time, I don't think the Russians ever believed that Ukraine would be weaponized against them.
Yeah.
Or for that matter, Belarusia. They saw these as, well, they're both Slavic states, much like ourselves. So, the Ukrainians gave up nuclear weapons. So it looked fairly benign, although at the time there were lots of people saying, we made a mistake because Eastern Ukraine is really Russified. And even in the 1990s, Dr. Brzezinski made that observation. I was there when I heard him say it. We need to be frank. You've got to write off Eastern Ukraine. For the most part, those are Russians. And the notion that Crimea, which had been Russian since 1776, would suddenly become this Ukrainian homeland, that's a lot of nonsense, And I think that, the Tartars, after all of their experiences, were probably happy to have the Russians come back because they were sick of the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are trying to Ukrainianize.
Yeah,
Tartars,
you will always find minorities that were suffering, and if you are out to stir up a pot, you will.
Yeah.
No, and that's what. So if we jump from Kosovo, let's jump just into the Ukraine situation. 2014, you once gave us a short interview at LifeSite where you related that the entire Ukraine war since 2022 has to go back to 2014 to the U.S. encouraged, organized Maidan and the coup, and with Victoria Nuland's infamous telephone conversation where she's already putting the new government together in Ukraine.
Well, what most important is also her expression of contempt for the Europeans. And I'm just astonished that more Europeans didn't pay attention to that, because that reflected an attitude that I also saw with Holbrooke. There was this attitude, well, you can't get anything done with the Euros, so we'll just do it.
Yeah, and that the Europeans allow to participate in this when the Americans look down on them like this.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Well, I think the best analogy, and I actually made this in 2000 after I'd come back. I said, if you look at Europe, they are the equivalent for the Roman Empire of the Greek city-states. Remember, the Romans always viewed the Hellenic civilization as superior to their own, and they freely admitted that they had borrowed heavily from them. To some extent, that was true in this country for a long time. We made the same argument, and with good reason. This is before we became self-loathing and then invited the Europeans to become self-loathing. But I think we took this too far. We decided that the Greek city-states would become obedient vassals.
Yeah.
And they have.
Yeah.
Which is deeply disturbing. But I suppose this is from decades of unearned prosperity, you might say, and unearned peace. I remember when I was an exchange student in Germany, people used that was back in 1969. several Germans would say, Douglas, we've never had it this good. We've never lived this well. This is the best standard of living we've ever had, and we want this to continue. Well, these were people that were born during the First World War or earlier making these observations. They knew what it was like, and they had been part of the rebuilding process. We didn't rebuild Germany. The Germans did. We did not rebuild Japan. The Japanese did. That's what we fail to realize that. Now, did we help? Obviously. We promoted a lot of the right things and policies, but my favorite example of this, because this is a problem we Americans have. We have this false view of the past. Well, look, we beat everybody in World War II. No, we didn't. Secondly, well, we rebuilt Germany. Germany's what it is because of us. No, that's not true. Same thing in Japan. I think his name was, I can't remember, maybe it was General Walker, who was the commander of the U.S. occupation. I could have the name wrong. It's a long time since I looked at this. But he was speaking to Ludwig Erhard. He had summoned Ludwig Erhard to his office because Erhard, without consulting the Allied Control Commission, made the decision to float the mark. In other words, he was living at the time after World War II with the price fixing and wage fixing that had been established during the Second World War by Hitler. And after the war ended, this continued. And he said, well, this is disastrous. We're never going to come out of this mess unless we float the mark and we're, build a truly free market. And he did this without being asked. And the general said to him, why didn't you come to me and tell me that you want to do this, and then we could have gone to the Allied Commission? He said, because they would have said no. And the general recounted, he said, you're right. Let's go have lunch. And he said he controlled the German occupation. It was the rebuilding of Germany. He controlled everything from the edge of his desk to the door of his office, and the rest of it was in the hands of the Germans. That's very important. Japan's another example. When MacArthur became the commander of the occupation, he had been given very explicit orders. The first order was put in jail everyone who was associated with the previous regime, all senior military leaders, everybody in the industrial sector, everyone who had a part in this, they all must be jailed. So, okay, did what he's told. Well, 3 years later, it looked like the Communist Party was about to win at the box office, or not box office, the ballot box. So George Kennan was dispatched to visit with General MacArthur and tell General MacArthur, you've got to release all these war criminals, get them back to work so that Japan has a chance to recover. They're going to have to lead this. We can support them, but we can't do it. And of course, MacArthur said, of course, obviously, agreed 100%. And the rest is history. Again, the Japanese stepped in and rebuilt everything. If you understand those two things, then you have to understand the folly that follows after World War II. It begins in Vietnam. We're going to transform Vietnam into this Anglo-Saxon democracy, this outpost of liberalism and goodness. We intervene in a civil war that we don't understand. We kill 2 million Vietnamese. We lose 58,000 Americans, over 100,000 wounded.
And we kind of helped to get rid of President Diem.
Oh, well, of
right?
course.
He's sending the green light.
All of those things were part of the intervention. And we go in there, and nobody knows what they're supposed to do. I mean, the first year that we went in there, they landed, and they said, well, what do you want us to do? And they finally said, well, there's some VC over here. Go fight them. There was no strategic thinking at all. Everything was emotion and impulse-driven. In fact, McGeorge Bundy and McNamara, in a conversation held, on paper back and forth, said, well, if we go to Vietnam, we'll probably lose. They said that. This is 65. But it's the right thing to do. Yeah. This is insane.
Yeah, that is. It's
well,
with the lives
you draw that line right up through, Vietnam, through the Balkans, through everything.
Yeah.
The one exception, of course, is 1990, 91, when Saddam Hussein intervenes in Kuwait. And we go in with limited objectives. We accomplish most of them, not all of them. But we decline to be entangled in the internal politics of the region.
The idea of nation building,
right.
That we can, to intervene into a culture, to even understand the background of a culture, and that was the whole discussion with Afghanistan. I remember my husband going to these conferences and even writing about it. What's this idea of nation building? How do you want to build a nation in a historically grown entity?
No,
but it's this kind of this hubris, this arrogance after World War II that has built up and there was never a reality check, it seems, to correct it or to become more of a cooperative player, of collaborator, of trying to find good solutions for things without just...
The thing that I think is interesting is that the senior military leaders at the time, certainly the Germans and the British that I dealt with, they thought this was lunacy.
Which one now, Vietnam or...
No, we're talking about it in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
They thought this was crazy. Remember, Vietnam's interesting because the British told us to forget it. They had no intention of participating in it, which was a very wise move.
Yeah.
But the point is that I think there were lots of people in the 90s that thought this was a bad idea. I know that the senior military leadership in the U.S. Army felt that way. Because when I was an officer in the War Plans Division, this is where your Army strategic planning takes place. And I was what they call the white War Plans officer, responsible for all of the standard contingencies, as opposed to the black War Plans officer who is dealing with all these special ops things, which, frankly, I didn't want anything to do with. I just didn't want to get involved in that committee. So I was very happy to be involved with the white war plans because you were dealing with straightforward forces, how much, how many, resources, everything else. And I had to sit down, and I worked for a very fine colonel, another one who should have been a general, but he was never promoted. His name was Foster. He was a very, very competent man, good head on his shoulders. And he said, write a response for the Army Chief of Staff on what we should do in the Balkans. And this is about this time we were getting involved in Haiti, which virtually all of us thought was a dumb idea. But again, that was everyone was overruled. But there were plenty of senior officers that thought, well, this is a wonderful career opportunity, whatever. But he said, write this. So I wrote this. It was a 2-pager, no more than 2 pages, explaining why we had no vital strategic interest in the Balkans, and why intervening there with military power in any form risked future confrontation with Russia.
That's excellent. So which year did you write that?
This is 95.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's very far-sighted.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it wasn't that hard to be that far-sighted.
Yeah, I mean, the opponent was on the ground. The British, Yeltsin. I mean, it was all falling apart.
Yeah.
And this idea of, well, let's keep respect or try to build up now a system of mutual friendship or whatever.
Well, at the time, that's what most of us thought.
Yeah.
We did not see Russia as an inevitable future enemy by any stretch of the imagination. So, and the argument that I made was, the landlord in this area historically has been Russia. What are Russia's interests? What did Russia do? What role did they play? And then you try to take people back through how many wars that had been fought with the Ottoman Turks over various territory to drive out the Muslim power and so forth. It's a waste of time. Nobody wants to hear it. And I could give you lots of examples of stories like this where you try to explain how was this border ever achieved, and this is how it came about. Nobody wants to hear it.
I know, and when we really go back to the fundamental principle of the just war doctrine, I mean, isn't our military essentially and fundamentally out to defend our own borders?
Well, in theory, but we won't spend a dime to do that. You mentioned this bill. There's nothing in it for the border.
Yeah.
And we seem to be absolutely extraordinarily committed to Israel's borders. In fact, we're willing to underwrite the expansion of Israel at the expense of its neighbors. We're willing to fight to the bitter end to rid Ukraine of its Russian opponent, but we won't defend our borders. No. Can't do that, and there's nobody in the Department of Defense standing up saying a thing.
Yeah.
Because all the senior officers are now fully on board with the political leadership. That was not true 20, 30 years ago. And this paper that I wrote, the Chief of Staff didn't change a word.
Wow.
He took it, signed it, and went over to the White House.
That's impressive.
He said, let's not get involved here. We don't want to do this. Same thing as Perry said. We don't want any permanent presence here. There was a sense that, look, let's keep things in
So when do
within
you think,
limits.
when did that spirit really change? Was it 1999?
I think the Kosovo Air campaign and the subsequent
there was
outcome.
A real change of
that was
paradigm
a big
shift.
Yeah, that was what they would call a strategic inflection point. And it was remember, we'd also become involved in Somalia, and that had gone very badly. And we knew that, which is one of the reasons in 95 I was able to write this paper. It went up to the Chief of Staff, and it was accepted because we saw Somalia. We don't want to do that again. Why are we trying to mix it up with the Somalis? Yeah. So I think that was the strategic inflection point. And then, of course, you had the other aspect of this. Under the Clinton administration, you appointed people as chiefs of staff and secretaries of service, and their job was to pick those who would go along. He's with us, we promote him. He's with us, promote him. He's with us, promote him. This continues, by the way, under Bush.
Until 2003. I mean, let's skip over Afghanistan, but the Iraq War was... my husband at the time was still involved as teaching at a military university, and he saw the development toward that war, and he doubted that there were weapons, mass destruction, and he wasn't going to be part of it. He saw this is getting irrational. What were the war aims? What were the peace aims? What were we doing in Iraq, Colonel Macgregor?
Well, we have this thing. We talk about this in the U.S. Army frequently. We try to train commanders of units, battalion above, three things: purpose, method, end state. What's the purpose of the operation that you're about to conduct? How are you going to do it? And what do you want it to look like when it's over? In other words, where do you want to end up on the map? Literally. And with what size force, with what capability? Because as soon as you fight, as soon as you move, you begin to lose people and equipment. That's a good formulation. And I wrote a piece called Refusing Battle, where I took this and said this has to be ingrained in everything that we do. Well, it's absolutely ignored because the purpose is always bizarre and unattainable. If you question the purpose, well, you're against us. He's an enemy.
Exactly. So I remember my husband speaking up at these conferences before the Iraq War, and there were people who wouldn't show up at the seminars anymore. You're against the war. This was the level of discourse. Isn't there someone based on his ethical understanding who had serious objections? So you were involved in that war at the beginning. But you
mean in Afghanistan?
Iraq, 2003.
Iraq,
but then you fairly soon kind of faded out.
Well, what happened with Afghanistan had an impact in the sense that it seemed to go quickly. But it seemed to go quickly, and people said, "Well, this didn't turn out to be as bad as we thought." And remember, you now have a different set of leaders. You had this man Shinseki, who was a favorite of the left. And he told his inner circle, this is a wonderful opportunity for the U.S. Army, both Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq. And people said, what's the opportunity? Well, this will help us justify our 10-division structure and end strength for the next 20 years. Because we can bring in divisions and let them sit here the way they have in Korea or Germany. So our force structure will be preserved. And of course, I was already in trouble because I had written a book called Breaking the Phalanx, where I said the force structure needs to change. We're not going to fight in the future the way we have in the past. The Cold War is over. We have a different set of potential adversaries and so forth. And that didn't go down because everybody's emphasis in military affairs at the top was keep everything as it is. And so they began to look at the opportunities for intervention as opportunities to keep things the way they are, keep up the end strength.
Justified.
Right. Keep the money flowing and so forth.
What kind of thinking about human lives that, how many civilians get killed? This is cynical.
Well, remember that the people that were going to raise objections to that in the 1990s after Desert Storm, they were weeded out.
Yeah.
So if somebody thought you were going to stand up and be counted, we got to get rid of him. Yeah. He's not a good guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have this, and you might also be able to tell us something about the neocons that gained a lot of power in 1996 with the Robert Kagan and the crowd that wanted to argue to go into all these, Syria, Wolfowitz.
Well, it really begins more than anything else with Paul Wolfowitz because he penned a memorandum, which all you have to do is Google his name, and it'll take you to the memorandum that he wrote, which was essentially a warmed-over version of Trotsky's Perpetual Revolution. And he was arguing that, we now had the opportunity because we were the last man standing, the only true superpower, to effectively build a new world order and reshape the world in our image. And of course, that's the kind of thing that Trotsky argued. Of course, it all fell apart in the war with Poland when the Poles defeated the Soviets and drove them back into the country, and that was the beginning of Stalin, because Stalin, In contrast to Trotsky, I mean, Stalin was not stupid. He was a highly intelligent. So
there was in the driving back the Pole. That was in 1920.
1920. That was in 1920, and it was devastating. I mean, the Red Armies were destroyed. Mm-hmm. Stalin had been part of it down on the southern flank, but Stalin was always opposed to it because he said, "You don't understand. It doesn't matter what you think you can do or say to the Poles. They're anti-Russian. You can't convert these people. Mm-hmm. You're not going to go into Poland and be welcomed." You know, Trotsky had in his mind, well, the workers in Poland, and then we break through and we'll be welcomed by the workers in Germany, because all the Bolsheviks wanted Germany because they saw Germany as the true fatherland of socialism.
Karl Marx.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
but it scared the Germans so much so that they,
of course,
looked for help against the Bolsheviks.
But the point I'm trying to make is this was Wolfowitz in the same mentality with this kind of
revolutionary.
That we're going to go everywhere and reshape everything and change everything, and we have this instrument, the American military. Yeah. The American military is obviously invincible, invulnerable. It cannot be challenged, and that was the lesson everybody thought they'd learned from 91. And when he turned around to people subsequently, he said, well, our troops did perform brilliantly, and our weapon systems were very good, but, this was not a particularly good enemy. In the sense, this was not a very strong, powerful force that we were facing. Iraq in 1991.
So the question is, did Saddam Hussein intend to attack the United States of America that would justify any military engagement?
Well, that becomes the next step. See, and this is pre-Wolfowitz. Remember, in Vietnam, people argued repeatedly. I remember listening to Lyndon Johnson when I was growing up in the 60s, and he'd say, we have to understand that if we don't stop them now in Vietnam, we'll be fighting them in Los Angeles. Well, that's absurd. Yeah. And then subsequently I listened to Abizaid, who was a 4-star, and he was put in charge of Central Command, and he's profited enormously from his position in other ways as a result, but he made the same stupid statement in Iraq. He said, if we don't fight these people now and defeat them in Iraq, we'll be fighting them in the United States.
I remember,
and I had friends who were over there and people that served with me in 91, and they said, yeah, Doug, what are these guys going to do? All get water wings and paddle their way across the Pacific to America? Yeah. They were all laughing. Yeah. The average American soldier's not stupid. Yeah. You tell him things like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, so you would agree, literally Iraq, Syria. Did President Assad intend to attack the United States?
Of course not. No.
Yeah, why were we meddling in
Well, that goes to a different source, and you have to go back and understand Israel and its position. Because part of the Wolfowitz strategy was to build a strategy regionally in the Middle East around Israel. And when we eventually go into Iraq, and he is the one that first of all, let's go back. You talked about what I had been asked to plan, which I did, and I provided. That was the advance on Baghdad. Nobody I met at CENTCOM, and that includes General Tommy Franks, and none of the people that I talked to down there, the planners, no one was prepared to occupy anything, and no one thought there was a plan to do it, and everybody agreed it was a bad idea. Yeah. The only difference between me and the rest of these people was that I thought that it was a fairly straightforward affair to remove Saddam and put another bunch of generals in there, declare victory, tell these people, we'll do business with you if you do business with us. If you won't, we'll come back and we'll remove you. But that wasn't the mentality in Washington. The mentality changed in the sense that they said, okay, this was an easy victory. Well, of course it was an easy victory. The country was in ruins. We destroyed it, So what did you expect? But there were also people in the Air Force, we have to bomb this, we have to do this. Yeah. And I argue you don't need an air campaign. All you need to do is drive to Baghdad. And I had lots of other people say that, and just drive there with with a column of troops. I had a British general told me I'd go with 15,000. But no one wanted to occupy the place, and everybody wanted to keep the administration, the Iraqi army intact, So pay them, get them started. You want them on your side and help establish a new regime that'll be friendly to us. And one of the reasons for going in there was clearly to help Israel's position strategically. Now, how? This is important. I didn't know it at the time. I found out about a year or two later from someone else who was very close to Wolfowitz that Wolfowitz had called up Scooter Libby, you've heard his name, working for Cheney, and said, I want to see the president. So, he comes over and they see Cheney, and he tells Cheney what he wants to do, and then Cheney brings him into the Oval Office. And, apparently Cheney knocked on the door and said, boss, Paul is here, and he's got a proposal. I think you should listen to him. Okay, come on in, Paul, He goes in there and he says, Iraq was weaker than we thought. And I was one of the ones that kept saying it's very, very weak. You're not going to need much. You don't need to destroy anything, but whatever. And in fact, later on, I was told by Newt Gingrich that several people, including Cheney and others, had said, yeah, this guy Macgregor was right. It's even weaker than we thought. But they didn't understand what to do with that. But instead what they did, what Paul Wolfowitz went in there and said, well, Mr. President, we have a brilliant opportunity. We have the opportunity to create the first Arab democracy in the region, and it will be friendly to Israel.
Yeah.
And Bush said, okay, guys, let's do it.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah, but when you think about this, so American soldiers died over there to serve the interests of Israel.
Well, partially. I mean, there was another reason. There was another reason that you wanted to go in, and I understand the WMD fear, although it was unfounded, but there was another bigger reason at the time, and very few Americans ever heard it. I'm sorry that Secretary of State Powell didn't tell everybody this, and that was that the Europeans and other nations, so the Russians obviously, and the Chinese and others in Asia, Japanese included, all wanted the sanctions on Iraq lifted because they wanted the oil and gas that Iraq could provide. And the argument was, if we don't do something soon, these sanctions will be lifted, and then Saddam Hussein will be flush with cash again. And when he acquires this, he can restart, his WMD program without interference and renew his threats against Israel or anybody else that he doesn't want.
But it's very potential. I mean, there were several steps, right? I mean, it's very potential.
Yeah. But it was not an illegitimate argument. It was based on fact. These things are going to be lifted, so we need to go in before that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Then the question is, if you're going to go in, what do you want to do? And again, going in quickly, remove the people at the top, get them out, put in another group. It's not very difficult to do. And they said, what do we do with our force? I said, well, you don't let them go into Baghdad. You keep them outside in the desert, away from the cities. You want to keep the administration. That was the only conversation I had very briefly down at CENTCOM. I said, eventually you can move down to An-Nasiriyah, which is where I ended up in 91 at the end of the war. There's a big airfield there. You could turn that into Ramstein East if you want. Doesn't make any difference, because in Iraq, people think of Iraq as being between the Tigris and the Euphrates. You're south of the Euphrates River. You're not far from Kuwait. It's only a couple of hours drive, if that. So the bottom line is you can sit down there, and if somebody calls you and says, we need your help, we're facing this or this, you can send in a group to help them, again, back up the Iraqi army. And at the time, I gave the example of the British occupation at Christmas in 1917 of Baghdad. And what happened there was the British had appointed a provost marshal, in other words, a chief of military police. And interestingly enough, that man was Victor McLaughlin, the movie actor. And he was a major in the British Army. I think he was in the Royal Irish Fusiliers, something like that. So he was then given 8 battalions of British infantry, and he was told, go get an equivalent number of battalions made up of prisoners of war under their own officers. So then they took roughly the same number, let's say, it would have been 4,000, 5,000 former prisoners of war, Arabs, Kurds, and Turks, under Turkish officers, arm them with batons, and make them the police that go into Baghdad to restore order, where there was disorder, much as we encountered. Only instead of doing nothing, the British sent these men in, and behind them were these battalions of British infantry with rifles and bayonets and so forth. If they encountered something they couldn't handle, then they would bring in the British infantry and do that. But otherwise, it was the Arab, Kurdish, Turkish troops with their former Ottoman officers that restored order. Well, order was restored in 24 hours. So what was the lesson? You don't do it. And there was a sense people understood, if we do this, we're going to have problems, because we're not Muslims. We're not Arabs, we're not Kurds, we're not Turks. We're foreigners. And we're Christians. We're viewed that way, one way or the other. But that is then subsequently jettisoned because you get this Paul Bremer who shows up. And again, Wolfowitz had a hand in this along with the other neocons. We're going to completely dismantle the government, the administration, and occupy the place and rebuild it from the ground up. Complete and utter folly and disaster. And I think at that point, I was in London in November of 2003. And at the time, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the British Army met with me, and he subsequently became a commander in Afghanistan. His name was Richard Evans. Very intelligent man, and he told me frankly, he said, I think we've lost Iraq. And he explained to me that they've had thousands of Iranians who had been training for years in Arabic and local customs and so forth that had gone into Iraq as soon as the government was defunct and settled in with the Shiites, whom they knew intimately, understood everything. In fact, many of them ended up as translators for us in the field, Iranians, and we didn't even know what we were dealing with half the time. And so his view was, we've blown it. And I think a lot of people recognized that by the spring of 2004 when we had this uprising, and the rest of its history. But you always have the same problem. And in 2005, I spoke at Leavenworth, and I think it was at the time that Dave Petraeus had just been assigned there as a 3-star, and he was going to put together this little book with his friends about counterinsurgency. And he said, what do you think we should do in Iraq? I said, Dave, we should leave. We need to get out.
Good for you.
And he went, oh, no, we can't do that. We can never leave. I said, what? He said, if we do, then Anbar province will become a platform for the projection of terrorism all over the world. And I said, well, good luck with that one. There's not much in Anbar province.
Yeah, as if trying to occupy a country for 20 years, inflicting injustices on the civilians is going to increase insurrectionist or, just resistance.
But here's the key point, and this is what Europeans don't understand. I've tried to get this across repeatedly to them. We are preeminently a naval and an air power. We are only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. If we put any troops on the ground, they're temporary. We don't live in Asia. We don't live in Europe. We don't live in Africa. So what are we doing there?
Yeah.
In other words, anything we do is inherently temporary.
Yeah, exactly.
Understand that.
Yeah.
The problem is that wherever we go, for brief periods of time, it's like sticking your hand into a bucket of water. As long as your hand's in the water, you displace the water. You pull your hand out, and the water returns. Yeah. All we do is disrupt the regional dynamics temporarily.
Yeah.
And eventually those dynamics return.
Yeah.
And there's a readjustment period, especially as we leave. It becomes very, very obvious. Again, no willingness to look at reality. Who are the principal powers in the Middle East? Historically, there are two powers that run things in the Middle East. The Turks, and this, of course, was the Ottoman Empire, and before the Turks showed up, the Persians. Those are the two great powers in the region. And their cultural influence, their administrative influence, all of that is visible wherever you go in the region. You see the Persians were here long before anybody else showed up. You go to Jerusalem, and the Mamluk influence, and they, of course, were a group of people that established themselves. They were very Turkish-like in many respects. They established themselves in Egypt, but they were not Egyptians. And they drive out, eventually, the Mongols. And then not long after, the Turks then move in and effectively drive us out of the Crusader states. In other words, take note of what's been here before. Understand who's running the show. It's just like the Balkans. Who's the dominant force in the Balkans, in Greece, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Serbia? Russia. All right, so before you do anything, you might consult with the Russians. Before you do anything in the Middle East, you might go to consult with the Turks and the Iranians. But we don't. No, we're right, they're wrong.
And that's how you not create allies and sustainable friendships.
Yeah, well, it's also called practicing economy of enemies. And that's how the British ruled a quarter of the world's population so successfully with a fraction of British people. Because they went in and they said, with whom can we do business? All right, let's do business with him and him and him. And who's the one that stands out that won't do business with us? Well, let's isolate them, get these others on our side, and then we can essentially take over and assert our interests. It worked. We do the opposite. You're with us or you're against us. Remember, that was George Bush's statement that came from this man from another neocon maniac. You're with us or against us. No, most of the world doesn't need to be involved. Most people are neutral, idiot. Forget it. Leave them out. Yeah. Don't make enemies where there are none. Yeah. But that's the way they do business. These are hard-edged, hard-nosed ideologues that believe they are right, everyone is wrong, and everyone must conform to what they want.
And they do so much harm. I mean, so much so that, I mean, when people listen to your podcasts or interviews, it's accelerating Ukraine. You know, the danger of an escalation with Russia is there, the escalation in Israel.
Well, I think we have some good news in Ukraine right now. When I say good news, I mean that's probably an exaggeration, but I think the people in Washington are sufficiently afraid that they are backing away from any sort of direct confrontation with the Russians in Ukraine. Washington has told Macron in Paris, forget it. Don't send any troops. I think behind the scenes we've told the same things to the British, but the British are too proud to say we were stupid. Made a mistake. No one wants to back down from the outrageous statements of the past and the stupid policies
we are winning
that they embrace. Just we're winning. Putin is losing. It's just insane. But
you called it from day one. I mean,
of course. But you know, strategically, it's very easy to understand. You know, where somebody asked me, well, where would you stop the Chinese since you don't want to fight them in Southeast Asia? And I said, well, I think the ideal place for us to stop the Chinese is sort of in the middle of the Pacific. And he says, what do you mean? I said, that's where the United States Navy has all the advantages. That's where we can dominate easily from space, from the land, from the sea. And if anybody tries to cross the Atlantic against us or cross the Pacific, they've had it. It's not going to happen. And there's no sense of letting your erstwhile opponent or your competitor overextend themselves. And see, that's what we don't understand. That's what the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and others have all let us do. We've overextended ourselves. And now we are a shadow of our power in 1991. 30 years ago, the kinds of statements that Biden and his friends make, you could make. Incautious and ill-advised, but you could make them because you had the credibility of the force behind you.
Yeah, I mean, the exhaustion of running 20 years Iraq war. And what I also wanted to bring up is just the social effects on our own country next to all the suffering of the civilians over there. But when you go to a military base today, you see signs, suicidal thoughts, call this number, and the other sexual assault warnings. So you see right going into any base, this is a military community that's falling apart. Because, I mean, we met on one base a soldier who was employed for 19 years. He was like a robot. I mean, what is this going to do to Americans, their families, the structure and the cohesion of families when they are, you know, in war for so many years? We are destroying. It's coming back. It's to haunt us. It's destroying our society. It's exhausting our infrastructure. Where did we put all the money that was supposed to strengthen our country? You know, make this country flourish.
Sure. We
squandered
our wealth.
Yeah, we are squandering, and now we are in this moment where. Would you agree that it's time to tell these elites, the neocons, re-emerging under Biden with Blinken and Nuland just leaving, but still she did enough damage, to tell these neocons and their allies, this is enough. You know, we want to take care of our own country. We want to rebuild this country and not go further. You know, keep funding Ukraine, keep funding Israel. Where is this going to end?
Well, see, the problem is that they're internationalists. They're not nationalists. In other words, there's no sense of America first.
Yeah.
What are America's interests? What are America's strategic interests? What do we need to do to preserve the United States, its power, its influence, its standing in the world? The British made this bad decision in 1914 to enter the First World War. Britain never completely recovered from the First World War. Then it repeated its mistake, put itself into a hopeless position that allowed FDR to bankrupt it and destroy it. And he was always the enemy of the British Empire. He took full advantage of the situation. So the British destroyed themselves, their standard of living, their wealth, their power, their influence, everything during the 20th century.
So we should have learned from them.
We are on the same road right now.
Yeah.
We are just as foolish, and they became caught up in some of these, what I call false moral arguments. We have a moral obligation to Belgium. Oh, no, you don't. Belgium didn't even exist before, 1840 something?
Yeah, and also as a mother or as a father, do I want my son to die on that soil?
Of course,
if he were to be deployed.
And the British were always very sensitive to that because the British population was not as large as, say, the population of Austria-Hungary or Germany or even France, and so there was a sense of limitation. One of the things that every British general was told when he took an army to the field, this is before 1914, is, look, this is all we've got. Don't lose it, because there's not another army waiting at home to come and replace you. Well, that changes the complexion of your operation. It means that you have an interest in avoiding fights. And you see, we came out of World War II, I think, as a nation, with the view, and it's not an unreasonable one, that the best way to avoid future war is by being prepared to fight one. All right, sounds good in theory. But there should have been a corollary that said, and just because you're prepared to fight one,
doesn't mean you
there's
need
no
to keep
reason
fighting.
why you should do it.
Exactly, because then you have to keep up the apparatus and the machinery. Yeah.
So what you should do is go back to the original thinking, which is, unless we're attacked, and we ourselves are at risk, or our vital strategic interest is at risk, we don't fight.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we spent the first sort of 160 years as a regional hegemon. We're the regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. Until recently, until we opened our borders at any rate, there's been nobody in the Western Hemisphere that could challenge us. The Canadians certainly aren't interested in doing so. We've had good relations with them. And despite the problems with Mexico, that resolved itself in 1865 when we sent 50,000 troops to the border with Texas and told Napoleon III and 32,000 French troops to get the hell out of Mexico. End of discussion. Then we won the Spanish-American War and ejected the last vestige of European influence and power in our hemisphere. That was enough for us. We didn't have to invade Colombia or invade Bolivia. That was never required, never needed. We don't even want to invade Mexico. There's never been any real interest in going there because there's too many Mexicans, and that would have a big impact on us, and we don't want to do it. Well, we've lost sight of that. Suddenly we determined that we're a regional hegemon, but we can also be a global hegemon. And we've lost our sense of balance. And any attempt to right that has failed because, someone would stand up and say, and I've said this many, many times, and I said it when I was in the War Plans Division, there was no pushback in 1994 or 95 to this. If we are not under attack, why are we going there? Are we really equipped to go into these places?
Wish that the nation would have listened more to you.
Well, it's not just me. There were others, except again, as I've tried to point out, anybody who talked in those terms was out. There's a man named Eikenberry. He made his reputation in Somalia. What a terrible place to say you made your reputation, but he did, and he was a big proponent for humanitarian intervention and nation building and all these things. He had a picture of Woodrow Wilson on his wall, and I was lieutenant colonel at the time, and he was a full colonel when I was in the War Plans Division, and he's a West Point grad, graduated a couple of years ahead of me. And he and I had a couple of discussions, and I told him I didn't agree with this, and I thought, he said, well, there's Woodrow Wilson on the wall, and I said, yeah, and he was the architect of disaster for the world. We should never have intervened in that war. Whoa, no, we were promoting democracy. It didn't work. I said, you don't want to go down that road. But he felt strongly. I mean, he was a true believer. Well, he ends up as a 3-star, and then he's the ambassador in Afghanistan. Well, how did that happen? Because he was playing to the audience. Now, I'm not saying he doesn't believe his own ideological nonsense. I think he did. Probably still does, and we'll never see reality. You can't, because then you have to admit that your entire ideological structure and foundation is false. And you can't say, I made a mistake. But you can. I disagree with that, but unfortunately he didn't. And so you have these people that, for reasons I've outlined, who were elevated. So by the time you get into Iraq, and by the time you were there for, in 2007, you stand up and say what I did,
and
or just leave.
Yeah.
Why don't you just leave? And I remember he said, well, that's impossible. Why would you say that? I said, because that's what we'll do. And that's back to my original point to the Europeans. What makes you think that we are permanently in Europe? I told a German audience that came to visit Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe with their students. So they were graduate students and so forth. And I said, this is 1999 after the Kosovo Air Campaign. I said, you really need to think long and hard about what you want to do as a nation and as a part of Europe. What are you talking about? I said, we will not be here forever. Oh, no, you will be here. And I said, no, we can't. We can't afford it. We'll never be here forever. It's an impossibility. You've got to deal with these problems. Oh, we Germans can never do anything. We can never lead anything ever again. And I said, well, you're fools, because you must. You are the inevitable once and future king of Europe, whether you like it or not, for all the right reasons. Now, of course, with a massive influx of foreigners and the suicidal policies they've embraced, perhaps Germany is finished. But in 2000, it was very strong, very powerful. And I worked very hard with some European officers on how do you build a European command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance structure. Because that's what you need. It has to be space-based as well as terrestrial, so that you can orchestrate and organize your own defenses and make decisions about where you will or will not go and what you will and will not do. Very difficult, because there was always this pushback. No, we need America. America needs to lead.
So it's a codependency on both sides. America enjoyed the influence.
We're not dependent on them.
But enjoyed the power and the influence, the Europeans were too much used to being led instead of developing an identity.
And of course, the exceptions to that are the British and the French. Neither of which are great powers any longer. Neither of which have the strength foundationally to do much of anything on their own. So what do? They attach themselves to our imperialist ventures and aims, thereby making themselves feel greater and more powerful.
Yeah.
And sadly, for the first time in my living memory, I watched the Germans do the same thing, which I thought was immensely stupid. I was absolutely certain that the Germans would stand up and say no to all of the stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, they did little, but they still involved themselves. And now the last thing I thought they would do is involve themselves in this Ukraine insanity.
Yeah.
All of the Europeans, they're just crazy. The Finns and the Swedes and the Germans, all these people, I've said, what are you doing? This is not the Soviet Union. And Russia today, it not only doesn't have the resources to take on all of Europe, it doesn't want to. It wants to do business.
And the Europeans are going to have the repercussions. I mean, the war is taking place close to their soil. The Americans are at a very safe distance.
Well, we're at a safe distance, but more important, we've got serious problems at home.
Yeah. And that's the last point that I would like to bring up on this wonderful conversation is, make America great again. This cannot be at the crowd that wants to make America great again cannot make Israel great again, serve the interests of another nation. It has to, my view, it has to be in the upcoming elections. The candidates need to be vetted according to whom they truly want to serve, and how do we rebuild this country? And this is where I would like you to tell us a little bit about your organization, because it seems it might have to be a grassroots development that we rebuild and have conversations among citizens to open eyes and to say at the elections what we want and which candidate we want and which not, because this is further and further eroding this country, this expansionism, this interventionist policy over the world.
Well, I think the good news is that most Americans have discovered that these interventions overseas don't make a lot of sense. Unfortunately, most Americans continue to treat what happens beyond their borders with very limited interest, if any. If you go into our school systems, look at our educational system, what are we teaching people? I was always struck by the disparity, or not disparity, but the dramatic difference in the quality of education between what the average French or German or Swedish or Swiss, even Italian students, they were much more informed about the world They had views that were based on fact, very little fantasy. Everything we talk about in the past is an exercise in self-congratulation with very little facts, and we just move on. And got to understand that if you live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I found these things out by living in various places in the United States, to be a successful American in Kansas City doesn't really require you to know much about anything. I mean, all you have to do is be willing to work hard. You have a grasp of basic math and basic, English, and you can buy a business or build a business, and you can be successful as long as you know the people in your community and you know what they want or what they can or can't do. In other words, you understand your region. You understand the supply chains in and out of your state, Kansas or Missouri. But you certainly don't need to know anything about Europe or Asia or anything else. Well, that's fine. Then what do you do when people are elected to office who know nothing? Nothing. And that's the hill. But they do know how to count, and they know where money comes from. And they listen very carefully to anyone who is in a position to make them wealthy. All you have to do is look at generations of people who have served in the Senate and the House, people with no business background or experience at all. Most people with no military experience or any experience in the foreign policy arena, most of whom know nothing about economics. In fact, large numbers of them are lawyers. And
empty vessels to be filled by someone else.
Well, yes, but most important by the man with the cash. Yeah. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, everybody talks about the Israel lobby, which is big and powerful, more powerful today than ever in our history. But don't forget the pharmaceutical industries. Don't look at the agricultural sector and ignore Monsanto and these other things. There's enormous cash out there, and that's what people who are elected figure out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And if you want to sit on the key committee, if you want to be the chairman or the vice chairman of that committee at some point, if you want to have a seat at the table in anything that's important to your district or your state, you need money. So where do you get it? Well, you can only go back to your home district so many times and ask for contributions. Pretty soon you have to accept the fact that, well, down the street are all these lobbies for all these various things. Which one seems to have an importance to you and your state, your district?
Yeah.
And then suddenly, you realize, well, who controls the financial sector? Who controls the media? Where do those people stand? What do they think? They can make you or break you. And then, as people have noted recently, you have the intelligence communities. And they collect on our own members of Congress, apparently. And I don't know what some of these people have done, but I'm sure that there are things that they're probably not pleased with. I mean, look, everybody has something they're not proud of.
Yeah.
But there must be some really bad things happening that people don't want revealed. And I think that's also part of this. How many trips to Epstein Island do you have to make?
I was just thinking.
And that's one of the reasons I said, Washington is almost Epstein Island on steroids. Yeah. Everybody is hostage to something.
Yeah.
So who represents the interests of the United States and the American people? Look at that bill. Where's the evidence for defending the border?
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. We're sending billions to Taiwan.
Yeah.
Not just Israel and Ukraine. Billions to Taiwan. For what? Who in their right mind would suggest that we should go to war with China over whom controls Taiwan? That's incredible. Why? What difference does it make to us? Well, they make microcircuitry. Well, we did too at one point.
Yeah.
What's wrong with us?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese and we are all dependent on this superb, industry of microcircuitry that exists on Taiwan. I see no evidence that the Chinese are going to invade that place or want to. None whatsoever. But this has now become a drumbeat. Now, some of that is designed to justify runaway defense spending, which has been our problem, in my judgment, since the 60s and 70s. After Vietnam, we were ruined financially as a nation. People don't realize that. Nixon did not wake up one morning and say, oh, gosh, I guess I'll take us off the gold standard. There was a reason for that. If he hadn't done it, we were looking at default. We were looking at economic catastrophe in the United States, a financial collapse. So it was supposed to be temporary. And like everything that starts in Washington as temporary, it becomes permanent.
Yeah.
Well, what do we do now? We're in much worse shape than we were in 1972 or 1975. infinitely worse shape, financially and economically. How do we avoid Armageddon? Well, now people are saying, well, we can inflate our way out. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Anything that saves the banking system and the financial system that's controlled by the wrong people.
Yeah.
I don't think that'll work, but all I'm trying to say, there are lots of people with lots of interests and lots of cash. Yeah. Now, then the question is, how do you change this? And you were talking about grassroots. Well, grassroots sounds great in theory. But if you don't control the organs of power, which is what Lenin talked about when he took over in Russia, then you aren't going to get very far. What are the organs of power? The military, the police, and the intelligence services.
Yeah, and they are captured.
And they are more important today than they have ever been.
But wouldn't you think, for example, your organization, Our Country, Our Choice, this is a connecting of people nationwide, at least to exchange ideas, to strengthen the identity of those who want the common good of this country and, want truly to heal this country. And so...
Well, I would say one other thing. Our Country, Our Choice wants to unite people across party lines. We think there are lots of Democrats and Republicans who share a commonality of interest around core issues. We think everybody wants to end the current immigration disaster. We want to defend our borders. We want to close this mess off. We want to restore the rule of law, which means we've got to expel these illegals. And we have to crack down on criminality. And that must happen. Everybody agrees with that. Whether you live in Philadelphia or Boston or Los Angeles, or very few people disagree with that. They may disagree on methods and how you do it, but they all agree on that. I think there's widespread agreement that we're financially insolvable, and we've got problems, and we've got to have to deal with those. And people would accept cuts to some extent in their budgets, but I think the next big issue for them is ending the overseas interventions. And people understand that you can have 50, 60,000 troops in Germany, or you can have another 50 or 60,000 troops here. So that means you can spend the money that's spent in Germany, or you can spend it here. And they're no longer listening to the siren call of the neocon. Oh, you can't leave. If you leave, the world will fall apart. Well, the world existed for thousands of years before we came around. It will exist for thousands of years after we leave. It's just like this nonsense about we can't let Russia win in Ukraine. Welcome to the real world. There's nothing you can do to stop it. And instead of doing the stupid things you have, which is to cultivate hostility, anger, and hatred in Russia for us, we could have come to some sort of amicable solution. And it's time to admit that NATO no longer serves the purpose it once did. Russia is not the Soviet Union. That's a lot of nonsense. But we can't go there yet. I mean, there's no willingness in Washington. And then I think we have to end these things like the sexualization of children in schools. I mean, it's just the stuff I've been seeing and reading. To me, it's abhorrent, incomprehensible. Children are innocent and should be innocent as long as they can be innocent. I don't see the rush to destroy that innocence. Don't understand it, but that seems to be part of this larger agenda. I mean, these are just some of the things, and they're electoral integrity. Our elections, how meaningful are they? I mean, it's just too much violation of law.
I mean, it's really a voice of common sense.
Well, you would think so, but common sense hasn't been very popular.
So how has been the response to your organization? How have
the response has been enormous, and it's very positive. But this gets to the heart of the matter. How do you really affect change? Well, there was a man, his name was Zumwalt. He was the Chief of Naval Operations, an admiral in the United States, a brilliant man, by the way. Had a very tough time in the 70s. He was CNO under Richard Nixon. Zumwalt was a very competent, very intelligent man. So was his predecessor, by the way. You don't want to get bogged down in some of the good people that we've had in the military, but we've had a number of them. Admiral Moore was his predecessor. Great man. Zumwalt talked about how do you achieve change in the Navy. And he failed. And he said, I failed to make the changes that I thought were important, and this is why. He said, you have to have three things. He said, you have to have people at the bottom that support you, because then they can reach upwards. He said, but then you have to put people in charge at the top who believe in it, who can push down against the middle. And he said, then on the outside, you have to have people in Congress who want to support the change. And he said, so you have three things moving simultaneously. getting Congress on board is probably not going to happen because too many people have figured out it's not in their interest, personal interest, to change a damn thing. So I don't bet heavily on Congress. We just saw, for instance, an attempt to remove this man, Mike Johnson. And I was so disappointed when he was appointed because all you had to do is look at where he gets his money from, and you said, my God, we're electing a disaster. This man's not his own man. So he's just performed exactly as I would have expected. And a lot of people have said, well, he meant well, he tried hard, he's a good, all this kind of nonsense. We got to go along. You always have the majority that wants to go along.
This explanation cost us $100 billion.
Yeah. Well, it's not just that. It's there's much more at stake than just the cash. And then, you had, 21 or some number of people that voted to oust him, or, it was some small number. Well, that's our problem right now. Yeah. You have the few courageous people. Andrew Jackson used to say, one man with courage makes a majority, and that certainly worked for him. But today it's tough. So you need a much larger force. OCOC can be that force in many ways, a foundation for something different, something new. But at the same time, that something different, something new has to fight its way to the top. And we'll have to see what happens. If we get the financial emergency that I think is coming, it'll be easier. Because once that occurs, people will be willing to say, well, that hasn't worked, and by the way, I can't buy enough food anymore, I can't put fuel in my gas tank. Maybe
kind of a pruning process.
Yeah, maybe we need to go with these people over here. I think that can happen, and we're trying to recruit good people, and I think we have some good people. But we're not there yet. You can't, certain things are in the hands of Providence. Providence will make the decision, not us.
Yeah.
And so that's why, somebody said, what do you recommend? And I said offhandedly, ora et labora.
That's beautiful.
Work and pray.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't know this, but, you go through these Cistercian monasteries that run through the center of Germany, because that used to be the border of the Germanic world until the Germanic peoples who were Christianized pushed to the east. And you go into these things, you see that, frequently on the wall, ora et labora. Well, there's much sense in that. There are too many people that talk about ora, and they forget the labora part. You've got to do both.
Yeah. And you can't have activism without asking God's protection and guidance. No.
So I think Providence has a role, and I think Providence will intervene in ways. It's sort of like the hidden hand that Smith used to talk about in capitalism. I see that as the divine influence. Of course, some people say, well, you're obviously delusional. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this has become very popular to pour buckets of filth and abuse over anybody who says, no, I really think there's something beyond this life, and I believe that there is the hidden hand of Providence.
Look at the world that they create who don't believe in divine providence.
That's a pretty frightening
They create
place.
hell on earth. That's not a good argument.
And I think we have evidence of that in the 70 years of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody, including Putin, would deny that.
Yeah.
Just look at the flip inside the Soviet Union, this dramatic 180-degree switch turn away from sort of materialistic atheism, which is nihilism. It's destructive. It leads nowhere. It's nothing. But we have a lot of that in the current leadership at the top. And a lot of people succumb to it because they say, it's overwhelming. It's too much. No, it isn't. It's not as overwhelming as you think. And that's why we keep telling members of OCOC, you are not alone. Don't think you're alone. If you think you are, call us, send us an email, talk to us. We'll tell you aren't alone. We have 370,000 people now who joined it. 370,000 people.
That's impressive.
And we've only really been around doing anything since January, and we haven't really invested heavily in marketing.
That's beautiful. If that's not a hand of providence, a blessing of trying to connect the good people to reinforce each other and to give courage to speak up or to form the minds.
By the way, I've been approached by people who are Muslims who said to me, you sound like you're a very Christian organization. I said, well, yeah, everybody's a Christian. Well, could I join as a Muslim? I said, well, that depends on what you believe in. And I said, I'm not talking about theology. You obviously believe in God. That's good. You have the 10 Commandments. It's fine. So what do you believe in? And then he said, well, I don't believe in the sexualization of children. I don't believe in open borders.
Yeah.
I don't think we should be fighting. I said, come on board,
Yeah.
And the same thing is true for someone who is Jewish. We have some that have said, well, you have this on everything you write. You talk about the truth setting you free. That's in the New Testament. I said, yeah, and we think it works. Is that a problem for you? He said, well, it depends on how you interpret it. In other words, people are saying, well, you're too Christian.
Well, we are a Christian nation originally.
Well, yeah, but we respect other people's views, and as I like to point out, I haven't seen very many Buddhists who started any wars. So I have enormous respect for Buddhism and enormous respect for Hinduism for the same reason, because the underlying tenets and philosophy are very, very positive, very good. If you look at the history of Christian Europe, it's pretty bleak. We have too many people killing each other for too long for dumb reasons. Now, again, this goes back to why people thought NATO, after the fall of the Soviet Union, had a role to play. That role was to prevent any further conflicts from happening. And I would have expected if NATO were real, instead of trying to drag Ukraine in, would have been more concerned about the people that are there and saying your best option is neutrality. You can be a bridge between us and Russia. This is a comfort zone for Russia, and it can be helpful to you, and you can be very prosperous.
Yeah.
Look at Austria.
Yeah.
Look at Sweden and Finland. Well, we didn't do that. We did the opposite. So I think Europeans are sobering up. Now, when you go to Asia, there's no one in Asia interested in going to war except us. Everybody says, what about that crazy man in North Korea? What about him? What's he done? His principal concern is his own survival. We had a chance under President Trump to begin denuclearizing that peninsula, but you had to recognize something. We have to leave. We do. We have to leave the Korean peninsula.
Yeah.
Now, under what conditions do you want to leave? Do you want to get something for your departure? I'm not sure we can anymore, but at the time that President Trump approached it, we could. The last thing the Chinese want is a war. So, well, they're evil, they're bad, they're doing well, wait a minute. The Chinese are Chinese, and they are an economic power. Everybody wants to trade with them, and everybody will. China is the manufacturing center of the world. By the way, it was for a few thousand years, and then it fell apart. Well, it's back. Now, you can either do business with them, or you can fight them.
Yeah.
I prefer to do business with them. But you could put restrictions on them. And so he said, well, what about the Chinese this? I said, look, close your borders. Get control of your airports, your seaports.
Yeah, keep an eye.
Take all these Chinese that have come here illegally, they go home, or they're out. Why do we let the Chinese go into our laboratories? Why do we let them into our businesses, our corporations? We've done that to ourselves. And then you are surprised that the Chinese are stealing intellectual property and sending it to the motherland? They've been doing this for 2,000 years. The Japanese and the Koreans will tell you this is typical Chinese behavior. And they'll say to you, how many Chinese do you see in our labs?
Yeah.
How many do you see in our universities? The Koreans and the Japanese know what they're dealing with, so do the Vietnamese. It doesn't require you to go to war. It does require you to be prudent, to exercise self-defense on many different levels.
Exactly, on many levels.
And we don't do it.
Yeah.
So that's the problem with China. And they say, well, look at all the ships they're building. How about all the cracks in the hulls? How about all the people in the shipbuilding industry in China who've been arrested for corruption? Oh, I didn't know that. They just inspected the rocket forces, the elites in the Chinese military, and they found that half the rockets, these are ballistic missiles designed for use against us, or cruise missiles if we try to invade China. The fuel wasn't in these things. They sold the fuel. I mean, come on, this is China. This is not Imperial Japan. And everyone looks past Japan. Well, they're an aging population. Japan is a very powerful state. Extraordinarily intelligent, capable people. We don't need to police Asia.
Yeah.
We need to get out of it.
Yeah.
We need to demilitarize our relationship with Asia.
Yeah.
But as soon as you say that, you'll have the whole U.S. Navy and Marine Corps up in arms, because without that, what do they do?
Yeah.
But that brings me to the other thing that people don't understand. The forces we have today are simply anachronistic. They are still tributes to the Second World War. One of the things that has worked very well for the Russians is that they have fundamentally rethought warfare. They have a new force now. They have new ways of doing business. They've organized differently. They've adapted. We haven't done any of that. And what we have will not work in the future. So if we want to avoid something like Pickett's charge, there was a Colonel Dunn, great person. Rich Dunn wrote this piece, and it was all about change in warfare. And he wrote it when he was at the National Defense University. And he said, everyone's on the march to Gettysburg and wants to join Pickett's charge. Anyone with any sense knew this frontal assault's not going to work. Now, Lee thought that this massive artillery bombardment had had more effect than it did. But that's something else we've learned, that strikes, overhead strikes, don't always achieve what you think they have. Well, you know the rest of the story. Pickett's charge was an immense failure. We're going to end up like Pickett unless we go into these forces and make profound change. But right now, the combination of ignorance and self-interest on the Hill, and I would argue self-delusion and self-interest in the Department of Defense, will prevent anything from changing.
Yeah.
Because if you're in the Navy, what do you want to do? You want to stand on the deck of a carrier with the wind blowing through your face with your scarf on and, whoa, look at my fleet. Those days are over.
Yeah.
You're not going to need a giant Jutland-style, Midway-style fleet. Not that structure at all. On the other hand, what you're doing in space and what you do beneath the oceans is vital and essential, and that can be dramatically expanded. Nobody really wants to go there. Everyone is clinging tenaciously to the obsolete. Everything. And what is obsolete? This notion of American political, military, financial hegemony is obsolete. Our armed forces, the structure, the focus, the orientation, the mentality is obsolete. And ultimately this notion of the nation that can be everything and nothing. That an American could be anything, and therefore if an American could be anything, then America is nothing. No. There is such a thing called an American. They're real. I'm one. You are. Everybody in the room is. We are not accidentally Americans. We did not wash up with driftwood on the beach. We are really Americans. There is an American people, culture, mentality, thinking. That was wiped away as a result of these two world wars. It's coming back.
Yeah.
People are realizing this is not what we are about. This is not what our mission in the world is.
Exactly, and that's really, we hope so much that with the help of your organization and these conversations that we come back to these roots and, find ourselves.
And by the way, we haven't said much about that. But what's happening in Israel today is an example of what we are not. Now, does this mean that we have not made mistakes? That we have not committed atrocious acts in ours? Of course not. Every people, every nation, you make mistakes, and you're supposed to learn from them and improve progressively through fault. Well, we figured a lot of these things out. There are things that we would never do today that we did in 1901 in the Philippines, where we killed 250,000 Filipinos in an occupation that was unnecessary in a place we had no business being, but we did it because we thought we were supposed to demonstrate our power and that Philippines was vital to us. Well, guess what happened after that? For the next 40 years, we tried to get rid of the Philippines because it's a strategic liability. We were trying to offload the Philippines all through the 30s. MacArthur was given specific permission by Franklin Roosevelt that if he could negotiate neutrality for the Philippines with the Japanese emperor, we would leave the Philippines because we knew we couldn't defend it. Well, that failed. And we know the rest of that particular story and that tragedy, what happened in the Philippines. And I keep trying to tell people, we need to understand that if we're not careful around the world, in the Middle East, North, Central Africa, wherever we go, we could end up on the way to Bataan. In other words, with thousands of American soldiers captured and marched off in ignominious retreat and defeat. We don't want that. And it's not necessary. It can be avoided. Well, MacArthur tried. He failed. The rest is history. We have too many people sitting right now in Syria. Very vulnerable. Same thing in Iraq. People say, well, look, we faced off those Iranians. The Iranians haven't done anything. These Shiite militias are not there to kill us. But if we take on Iran directly, they will. Same thing is true with Hezbollah. We need a different solution in the Middle East. And one of those with Israel is to live with its neighbors. Now, it's not easy, especially when you've had, how many years? 70 years of hostility and fighting.
But we still would be
But we did have success after 73. And tragically, we now have Sisi warning Israel, if it doesn't cease and desist in Gaza, that he's going to renounce the terms of the 73 Camp David Accords, which I think would be catastrophic, because that opens the door to much more.
Yeah.
And we have to understand that the Turks, the Iranians, are not hapless fools. These are not Bedouin Arabs that have no air defenses, that have no armies, that have no air forces, that can be bombed at will. They have high concentrations of smart human capital. They have exceptional capabilities in all sorts of areas, from cyber to in rocketry. It doesn't make any difference. These people are not pushovers. They have resisted intervention, thank God, to this point. But there's no guarantee that that will continue.
Yeah.
And there was an attempt on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's life quite recently. That's a bad sign, because what that says, he had announced that he was prepared to return to normalization with Israel. His population will have nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
So the hatred, the violence is metastasizing in the region.
Yeah.
We have proven,
we are not helping.
We have proven completely inept. We are so busy saying, "Oh, I'm going to fight for Israel. I love Israel. We want Israel, please."
Yeah.
And where's my money? Reward me for my fealty. This is a bad situation.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have
it's
large numbers.
It's actually not helping them, and it's not helping us. It's not being a good friend,
A friend of mine, in fact, he's not really a friend. This is another person, Jeffrey Sachs. And he said that what is being done to Judaism as a result of this is catastrophic. I've simply thought that Netanyahu has put the very existence of his state at risk unnecessarily.
Yeah.
There were various ways to respond to what happened on the 7th of October. It's also open to question what happened on the 7th of October. How could that have ever happened? I'm still suspending disbelief. But in the final analysis, what we're doing right now is going to make matters worse. It's not going to help anything.
Oh, it's a genocide.
And hundreds of thousands of people are going to be killed.
Yeah.
And this will not go unnoticed. There was a program called Shoah, all about the Holocaust, which had a profound impact on me. And this particular lady was English, married to a German, and she described something that had happened to her on a train ride, and this was just before the Battle of the Bulge.